Thank you all for being here. As you know, I go way back with Evan. I think you were talking about when I broke your nose playing touch for just a moment ago.
I broke my nose on his forehead about 25 years ago.
Yeah, I think it was 35 years ago. I think we're getting old now. But Evan has been able to capture both history and personality in the intersection in a whole series of books, the latest of which is Ike's Bluff. I can't think of a more timely book. If everybody's saying, how do we figure out how to deal with Iran or foreign policy or anything else, and Eisenhower's cool way of doing things, somewhat enigmatic, but also he knew where he was going. And you've captured, unlike any other book I've ever seen, his personality, but also his policy. So it's my great pleasure, here it is, to tout and welcome my friend Evan Thomas. Thanks for coming, Evan.
Aside from breaking my nose, Walter has been the most wonderful friend anybody could ever have. I mean that from the bottom of my heart.
Oh, you can take your name tag off, too, because they know who you are. And Osi, his wife, and Mary, his daughter. You know, the titles, if I'm correct from remembering the book, General Goodpaster, Andrew Goodpaster, says of Eisenhower, he plays bridge like a poker player. Does that sort of sum it up?
Yeah, I mean, I got the idea for doing this because I was talking to John Newhouse, who some of you may know.
John's here, right? Wave your stand up, John.
Okay, John.
The great writer on nuclear power.
John Newhouse.
Yeah.
This book began because John and I were having lunch and we were talking about the Dulles brothers. John had been thinking about doing a book about the Dulles brothers. Was I interested? Sure. But anyways, John started describing General Goodpaster, who some of you probably knew, who was a was the staff secretary and really the national security advisor to President Eisenhower. John was telling me that Goodpaster said, you know, Ike never told him whether he would have been willing to use nuclear weapons or not. Now, Goodpaster said he's quite sure he wouldn't have used them, but what intrigued me was that even with his closest national security aide, Eisenhower never said whether he would use these weapons or not. So that got me thinking, boy, talk about the loneliness of command. I mean, here's the first person, this is going to be a grandiose statement, but I'll make it anyways, the first person in the history of the world to have the power to destroy the world. Because he was the first one to have a nuclear arsenal. By the time he left, he came in with 1,000 nuclear weapons and left with 18,000 nuclear weapons. Right. That's a lot of nuclear weapons.
Much to his chagrin.
Right, much to his chagrin. And the morning after his election in 1952, in the golf shop at Augusta, he got a briefing on a new weapon then known as the Super that was 500 times the size of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we're talking big weapons. So he's got to contemplate whether to use these things. But when you think about it, he could never tell anybody. Because once you tell people whether you're willing to use them or not, there goes the deterrent effect. Because then the other side, now you could say, well, it won't leak. Well, of course, in Washington, everything leaks, even the deepest secret. So he never, ever, ever told anybody. Now, the title comes from, he bluffed with these weapons. His central insight was that, and I wish some other presidents would take this on board, small wars become big wars. War is a mutating monster. Politicians who think they can control it are fooling themselves. You know, that line from Clausewitz that war is just politics by another means, that's a line everybody fixates on. But if you actually read the thing, and I got alert, this is not my idea, there's a guy named Campbell Craig, a scholar named Campbell Craig, who turned me on to this. If you actually read Clausewitz, which I don't recommend because it's the most slowest Germanic, it's like reading Kissinger on steroids.
Oswald Spengler.
His real message is that politicians can't control war. And that was the message that Eisenhower took to heart. Now, he had a lot of personal experience with this, having run the invasion of Europe. And interestingly, Eisenhower, this great war hero, never saw combat himself. because he missed World War I, because he was home training troops in the United States. And in World War II, he was way too important and knew too many secrets to let him near the front lines. But he saw a lot of battlefields, often the day after, and he writes about the smell of them. He was always cleaning after the mess of war. You know, it was a great war and our troops were great, but Eisenhower once got so fed up with rapes by American soldiers that he wanted to line them all up and machine gun them. I mean, that's the level of responsibility that he was dealing at. And tellingly, after the war, he flew in a small plane from Berlin to Moscow over the Ukraine and followed the path of first the German army going that way and then the Russian army going that way. And in that 1,000-mile stretch, he did not see a single building standing because of the ravages of war. So he had a great appreciation for the horrors of war, as only a real warrior can have.
I'm trying to remember in history, he's the only president going back to when who never really sent American troops to war.
Well, that's, you know, I mean even Gerald Ford did the Mayaguez.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But let's, I haven't done this math. I mean,
Guess Hoover.
Hoover.
Yeah,
Hoover.
Although, when you and I were first talking about the book, the one time he does deploy the 101st Airborne.
It's in Arkansas. It's in
Little
Arkansas,
Rock.
In Little Rock, to integrate the public schools there. But this appreciation of war made him not want to fight any wars. The way he did it was to threaten the ultimate war, was to threaten to go nuclear. And most of his advisors disagreed with this. They said, no, we got to be able to fight little wars here.
Right.
Flexible response was the faddish. Ironically, small world, my father published Maxwell Taylor's book in 1959 that made the argument for flexible response. Right. At the time, I think that was the wrong argument. I mean, I think right.
Kissinger, Mac Bundy, Maxwell Taylor, they all want tactical nuclear weapons, and Eisenhower sticks to what's called mutual assured destruction, right?
Well, that's the term that came later. The massive retaliation was the term they used. But the idea was you threaten the Soviets and the communists for any aggression anywhere, and we will respond with the means of our own choosing, meaning nuclear weapons. And again, most of his advisors said that's not realistic. The Europeans don't like it. We got to be able to fight small wars. But Eisenhower was an all or nothing guy.
Well, because he understood small wars become big. Right. You know, and the time he bluffs and talks about using nukes is actually in Korea, right? Do you think he was sincere?
Well, again, we'll never know. The other great thing, many things I love about Eisenhower is a decision maker. Unlike me, he never decided things until he absolutely had to. I'm impulsive and impatient, and as my wife will tell you, I got to decide right away. He would wait until he absolutely had to decide. And on Korea, there was a lot of talk about using nuclear weapons, and there was a lot of contingency planning for using nuclear weapons. But I'm pretty sure he never decided because he never had to.
But
decide.
He talked about it.
But he talked about it, and he put the word out secretly through the Indians
or
and
semi-secretly. I mean, you're sending it to the Indians that we might use
through
nukes.
Channels and through hints and so forth. That the word was sent to Moscow that if this thing doesn't end, we're going to use nukes. The scholars debate on whether that message actually got through. I think the bigger meaning was that the North Koreans thought, oh my God, General Eisenhower's in charge here, and they started bombing dikes, and the conventional bombing picked up. And I think it was just the fear of Eisenhower more than anything else. But he was able to use his position and his war record to be fearsome, and the North Koreans signed an armistice. And once that happened, in the summer of 1953, Eisenhower never sent American combat troops, sent troops into combat again. I think 2 or 3 soldiers died in his 8 years. I think one in an accident in Lebanon, a couple of advisors in Vietnam. But he used to claim I didn't lose any troops, and that's close enough. And as you say, what other president can claim that?
You know, those of us who hadn't studied into your book, Eisenhower, always think of his farewell address as, whoa, where did that come from? You know, warning about. But in your book, you talk, I think it's called The Chance of Peace, was it, early on?
Yeah, Chance for Peace was April or March 1953. Among his insights was that the military couldn't be trusted with money.
Right.
And he would say, "Oh, the Pentagon, I know those boys at the Pentagon," he would say. And he said this over and over again. And right away, winter of 1953, the Air Force is asking for more air wings. We got to have, I forget the number, 84 air wings. And Ike is going, "No, we don't." And he consistently, in fact, this is a little known fact, Eisenhower actually reduced defense spending over his 8 years, even as we were building up for the Cold War. How did he do that? Because we built missiles, we built SAC, we enormously strengthened our nuclear arsenals. He did it by cutting the hell out of his own service, the Army. That did not endear him to his old buddies in the Army. In fact, 2 Army chiefs of staff quit, Ridgway and Taylor, because he was so mad at them for cutting the Army. So he wasn't advertising this, but he was quietly keeping a lid on defense spending. And this had big economic meaning because in the 1950s, the federal budget was about 60% of the federal budget was military spending. Today, it's about 25%. The big bucks were in defense.
What percent?
60 then, 25 today.
Oh, wow.
Because today, it's all social welfare, transfer payments, Medicare, and Social Security. But in those days, the big money was in defense. So if you wanted to control your deficit, and you want to control spending, it's the military. You got to cut in the military. There was unbelievable pressure in the 50s to spend more in the military because of Sputnik, because of the Cold War, because of the Soviet threat. And Eisenhower fought a very kind of lonely, he did not advertise this, but a very lonely struggle to keep a lid on what he deemed to be unnecessary defense spending. So that famous speech he gives at the end, warning against the military-industrial complex, which is his farewell address, he'd actually been doing that all along. He just articulated it as he was going out the door.
It's a pretty dramatic scene of him doing the chance for peace speech, right? And didn't he like eat bad fish?
No. I mean, one thing that's so interesting about him, he projected this utter confidence and smiles. His stomach was killing him all the time. He internalized the stress. We all have our weak link, and his was his stomach. And although he never showed it in this particular case, usually when he gave a really important speech, he gets sick to his stomach. And in this case, and he wrote a very moving speech that talked about for every jet plane we buy, that's 5 schools that we don't buy. He did all this equivalence.
I mean, this is a George McGovern speech.
It's a McGovern. I mean, it's totally a peacenik speech, which he gives right off the bat as president. But he's so sick that he's skipping the pages. He doesn't finish the speech. His aides are going, "Whoa, is he going to make it?" Because there are beads of sweat and he's gripping the. But and this was typical. He had his intestines were operated on as president. He was sick a lot.
Is that because of stress, or was it just?
I think so. He did have. I'm not bad on the medicine. I mean, he had colitis. He did have an obstruction in his colon, so he had a sort of a weak link. But the medical records, which are available and which I've read, strongly suggest in fact, they don't suggest it. They say that stress had a big impact.
His secretary, I think, right? Yeah, is always worried about him.
They're always worried. It's funny. Of course, he had a heart condition. He had a heart attack, 1955. He was in the hospital for 6 weeks. He had a stroke in 1957. Pretty serious stuff. And they were worried he had high blood pressure, and the doctors were always hovering over him and saying, "Don't worry." And he would say, "What do you think this job is?" He was a warrior.
Yeah. You talk about him tamping down the military's desire for spending. He also is tamping down the extreme anti-Soviet, not just McCarthyism, but even John Foster Dulles early on as Secretary of State.
Well, this is sort of a good cop, bad cop thing with Dulles. Dulles was a Manichaean forces of light versus the forces of darkness, which was really not Eisenhower's style. But Eisenhower gave Dulles a pretty long leash and used him to. It was Dulles who gave the massive retaliation speech. Eisenhower wrote the words. In fact, the press was fooled for years. The press thought that John Foster Dulles was making foreign policy in the Eisenhower administration because he was the spokesman. Years later, we find in the files Eisenhower's handwriting, writing the key words in the speech. So this is hardly my discovery. This is Fred Greenstein knew this 30 years ago. Eisenhower operated with a hidden hand, And he often let other people do the talking for him while he was sort of blandly, innocuously, gee, he'd be asked at a press conference, well, how about this? And he'd say, I don't know, go ask so-and-so. Yeah. He would just told so-and-so what the policy was. He did that all the time.
But the relationship with Dulles, or John Foster Dulles, is the most interesting and complex.
It is, and it's a poignant relationship because, as so often happens, the surface is really not. Dulles was seen as a pious, righteous, rather cold figure, but actually Eisenhower found him to be a warm, kind of sweet guy
who needed some hand-holding.
Ike was seen as this sweet, gentle guy. Ike was a hard man. I mean, there's one of my favorite moments. And Elsie and I were having lunch with John Eisenhower, who is Ike's son, who's now 90 years old, but definitely has all his marbles. And we were talking about the balance between the apparent warm, sunny President Eisenhower and the cold-blooded Eisenhower. And John Eisenhower said of his father, make that 75% cold-blooded.
Yeah. Now, there are a lot of little quotes from John Eisenhower, little anecdotes on the...
Well, I was really fortunate with John Eisenhower because Eisenhower is General Eisenhower, he retired as a brigadier general, Ambassador Eisenhower, told me right off the bat, he said, I've never figured out my father, so good luck. But then he started, as O.C. will tell you, we started trying doing it together.
Peel off the layers.
And Eisenhower had a sense of humor. The opening line of John Eisenhower's memoirs is, I sometimes think I was born standing at attention.
Yes, right.
Can you imagine being General Eisenhower's son? And he spent most of the rest of his life trying to figure out his father. And he worked for his father in the White House. He was General Goodpaster's chief staffer, John Eisenhower was. So he was a wonderful witness for me and handled all the classified stuff, including his dealings with the CIA.
We're talking about dealing with the Soviets, too. And what interested me is Eisenhower's trying very hard not to provoke them. I mean, there's the balloon flights, and unfortunately, he's ordering the U-2 flights to stop as well, right?
Yeah, no, he's I mean, one of the reasons why he couldn't brag about, well, the U-2 flights, we put up a spy plane starting in 1956 that had the capacity to fly over the Soviet Union and see what was on the ground. And from that, we learned that the Russians were themselves bluffing, that all this talk of Khrushchev, that we're cranking out rockets like sausages and all that, was bluff. The U-2 couldn't find any Soviet rockets.
But Eisenhower can't say it out loud.
He can't say it. He can't say it because he's going to give away the U-2, and because that would embarrass the Russians. The Russians know about it, but they don't want to admit to it.
But see, that's what amazed me, is that he was so psychologically sensitive to the Russians.
He was. He spent a lot of time trying to figure out Khrushchev, which was not all that easy. Khrushchev was a blustering, canny, savvy, very difficult guy. And there's one great scene, and Ike had to do a lot of this long distance. I mean, Ike didn't even know who was in charge in the Soviet Union until 1955. We forget how little we knew about our adversary.
And all those weird, it's like China today.
I mean, it was the denied territory. It was officially called the denied territory. And our first CIA case officer got thrown out in 1954, got caught in a honey trap by the KGB. So we did not have good intelligence. And so Eisenhower is doing this from a distance, but he's trying to figure out Khrushchev. Who's his adversary? Who's he dealing with? He does have intelligence from the U-2, but he invites them in 1959 to the United States. And Ike really wants to try to get détente going here. And Khrushchev is in a high, blustering mode. He has threatened, delivered an ultimatum, that if the West is not out of Berlin in 6 months, the tanks are going to roll. And this is a huge crisis, because this was the flashpoint of the Cold War. And the Allies are going crazy, and all of Ike's advisors are saying, no, we got to send more troops to Berlin, and we got to build it up. And Eisenhower goes, no, we don't. He actually cuts the number of troops by 50,000. Everybody thinks he's crazy, all alone on this. And then he invites Khrushchev against the advice of all of his advisors. He invites him to the United States. Khrushchev gets here. Ike takes him on a tour in a helicopter over rush hour Washington. and to show them American prosperity. And of course, Khrushchev gets down and says, "Oh, I just saw a lot of rush hour and traffic." And then he says, "But can I buy 3 helicopters and a Boeing 707?"
That's right.
And then they send Khrushchev off to meet Marilyn Monroe and all that. But finally, they get him up to Camp David. And Khrushchev is continuing to bluster. And a good pastor writes on a notepad, he writes, "Impasse." And so Ike takes a nap, and he wakes up and says, "I got an idea." And he calls up his daughter-in-law, John Eisenhower's wife, Barbara, and he says, "Get your kids scrubbed up and have them on the porch in 30 minutes." And this is a half-hour away, their farm at Gettysburg. And they drive to the Eisenhower farm in Gettysburg, a half hour from Camp David, because sure enough, Khrushchev sees those beautiful little grandchildren. He starts talking to them and giving them stuff, and he comes back and withdraws the ultimatum because Khrushchev had grandchildren too. And the central insight that Eisenhower had about Khrushchev, for all his bluster, he was a survivor. After all, Khrushchev survived Stalin.
Right.
He knew that behind that bluster you could reason with him.
Eisenhower was pretty upset when Stalin dies. We have no clue, right?
He blows up. I mean, he at his own.
Because he has a bad temper. You notice in his book. Yeah.
You never. It was one reason why his stomach hurt so much is you never saw this temper in public. But his aides, one of his aides said it was like peering into a Bessemer furnace when he blew up, and he would blow up. And in this case, Stalin dies. Early March 1953, Ike has been in office for, 6 weeks. And he says, "Okay, what's the plan?" There is no plan. And Ike blows up because the CIA has had all this time to prepare. There is no plan because they have no idea what's going on inside the Soviet Union. And they're all feeling in the dark here in the early 50s.
But besides dealing with his Khrushchev's bluster, I was surprised at how dedicated Eisenhower was to disarmament.
Yeah.
And tries pretty hard.
He does. It's a hard go internally. It's so often
but his problem wasn't with Khrushchev.
Right,
it
your
was
own government.
with,
well, his problem was with Khrushchev, but it was also with his own government because he had the guy who ran the Atomic Energy Commission, Strauss,
Louis Strauss,
Admiral Strauss, was a hardliner's hardliner.
And not really an admiral, but
not really. World War II sort of admiral.
Yeah.
But liked to be called Admiral Strauss. And he was a hardliner and was determined not to cut back our nuclear arsenals no matter what. And for a long time kept scientific advice away from Ike that said that you could actually have a test ban treaty and check each other. Finally, Ike broke through that. Strauss was sent off to be Commerce Secretary and actually didn't make it because he was turned down in Congress. But slowly, grindingly, they did make some progress on arms control that became, under Kennedy, the limited test ban treaty.
But it showed in some ways Eisenhower's great weakness, maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, which is he couldn't really deal with the bureaucracy. I mean, he's ordering them to cut the amount of nuclear weapons, and they just don't do it.
Yeah, I struggled with this. Truman said, Ike's going to get in there.
Yeah, right.
And he's going to give all these orders, and nothing's going to happen. Yeah. Because it ain't like the military, where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or maybe that's not a good example, but a general of a division could say, "Do it," and it gets done. Doesn't happen that way in the federal government. And Ike ran into a lot of bureaucratic opposition. And although he was a tough guy, he did not like to fire people directly. He liked to have Richard Nixon do it or somebody else do it. He was a little weak on that front. And one of the people he should have fired was Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA. In fact,
John Foster's brother, which makes it hard to fire him. I mean, you get benefits from having the CIA director be the brother of the Secretary of State, but there are also real liabilities. And one of them is you can't fire the head of the CIA without offending Foster. But the CIA, which had those early successes, we don't today think of them successes, but Guatemala and Iran at the time looked pretty good. That on the cheap we could overthrow foreign governments and contain communism that way. They stopped having so many successes by the mid and late 50s, and Ike's own advisors are telling him, the CIA is out of control, it's not working, Allen Dulles really ought to go, and Ike says,
It takes a special kind of genius to run an intelligence service, and he just doesn't want to do it. And then
did he ever fire anybody?
Did he ever fire anybody? I could probably some experts in this who can answer this. I don't think so. I don't think he ever did. He had Sherman Adams, his own chief of staff, but again, he had Nixon do that.
Yeah, well, that was a little bit different than CIA.
I only hesitated because Adams was but told. He resigned. He wasn't fired, but he was.
Nobody ever does anything but resign, but he had to resign.
And actually, he insisted on seeing. He insisted on seeing Eisenhower. Yeah, I forgot this. He insisted on seeing Eisenhower, and Eisenhower didn't say "you're fired," but it was one of those awkward meetings where the writing was on the wall.
But he's pushing disarmament, trying to cut our production of nuclear weapons, and even pushes back at the whole concept of deterrence in a way, right?
Well, no. I mean,
I'm thinking of the Roger Simon, or the Simon and Schuster guys.
Yeah, he wrote a great letter in 1956 to Simon of Simon and Schuster, and he said the problem is no longer man against man or country against country. It's man against war. The problem now was war itself, and so how did you make that? How did you contain it? How do you deal with it? And, you know, he was hardly a pacifist. You couldn't just roll over and hope that the Soviets
But
were going to
didn't
go away.
he say, let's stop testing, kind of orders everybody to stop testing, and then there's like 19 more tests, and then the British...
85 more tests.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Right.
Because the British, I mean, it's just tough with the bureaucracy. The British want to start testing because they're developing their own atom bomb. There are always these other factors at work. And so after Ike himself said no more testing, that year there were 85 more tests until they did do a unilateral ban.
What was his management style? When we talked about him not firing people.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly a lot of indirection, a lot of hidden hand. Interesting, he was a big believer in plans and planning. He had a famous saying that planning is everything, but plans are nothing, which I think he got from von Moltke. I think he got that from the Prussian. And so he had an elaborate planning process, all sorts of committees, and he joined in it. He would come in, he would argue both sides. You never quite knew where he was coming from because in the mid-meeting he would switch sides and argue the other side. So he robustly engaged in a planning process. But meanwhile, he had a whole secret operation going. He had back channels.
So a lot of indirection.
A lot of indirection. He believed very much that he had to have the trust of the American people. And he was not a great speaker on TV, but he used TV a fair amount, and he conveyed a kind of trustworthiness. He had trouble with teleprompters. This was an early thing. One time during his speech, he said, so suddenly stopped and said, "Make it go faster!" So he had trouble with teleprompters, but he conveyed a kind of trustworthiness and a decency and a kind of virility. Ambassador Bruce, David Bruce, used the Latin word vir to describe Ike. He was manly, and you could sense that about him in his voice and his demeanor, and one of his favorite words, deportment. He had a virile deportment, a manly military deportment. So he believed it was important for the American people to trust him, and so when he lied, he was pretty careful about not being caught at it until actually the U-2 was shot down, and then he got caught in a massive lie, and he was broken-hearted, not just because it was going to disrupt the summit meeting and screw up détente, but because his own credibility was now called in question. They had a big cover story. It was a weather plane, and they went through various versions of this cover-up, and of course it all got exposed when the Russians... Why did they do all that covering up?
The Russians knew the U-2 was ours. They knew, we knew, everybody knew except for the American people. Why, I never could figure out why Eisenhower stumbled on the U-2.
Because the Russians, leading up to the shoot-down, the Russians didn't want to admit that the Americans could fly over us. But if they publicly admitted it, Khrushchev was going to come out and wave his rockets and demand that we stop it. So it was sort of a silent agreement between both sides. The Russians tolerated it as long as because they couldn't do anything about it until they built an anti-aircraft missile that could reach it. And one of the things the CIA did wrong in this period was the CIA knew those Soviet air-to-air missiles, surface-to-air missiles, could reach the U-2, but they did not tell the president, because the guy running the program, Richard Bissell, was a risk taker. He was a great bureaucrat, but was a dangerous risk taker, and they suppressed this study, and the U-2 got shot down right on the eve of this crucial summit.
Yeah.
And Khrushchev set a trap. We didn't know. We knew the plane had been knocked down, but we didn't know that the pilot had been captured.
Francis Gary Powers.
We didn't know for a few days. So we were saying, well, it's a weather plane, and then we said, well, it is a spy plane, but we sort of gradually had rolling cover stories. Finally, Khrushchev, to his great sort of delight and glee, trots out the pilot. We have the pilot. It was hugely embarrassing to the United States and to Ike, because it ruined, some people think this was the very beginning of public distrust in the government, the credibility gap ideas. There is a view that it really begins with this blowing this cover story. Ike came into the Oval Office that morning and said, I want to resign, to his secretary. Now, he didn't really mean it, but it shows you the depth of how badly he felt that his own trust had been shattered by this.
But it was unnecessary, right? Did he have to do the cover story in the rolling line?
Well, I think it was so built in, deniability was so built in. I mean, you can reconstruct this, and maybe they should have admitted right off, but they thought that they could get away with it, and it was so sort of hardened that you deny everything having to do with intelligence. In those days, CIA actually got away with keeping secrets. The press was a lot more pliant. I mean, it always interested me that the press knew about, this is one of my favorite CIA stories. Imagine this happening today. The CIA's man in Guatemala finds out that the New York Times' man in Guatemala finds out that the CIA is about to overthrow the government of Guatemala. And he wants to write a story about this. So one of the Sulzbergers calls up his old Princeton buddy, Alan Dulles, at the CIA and says, Times wants to run a story about this. Dulles says, don't do that. And sure enough, the Times sits on the story, and they move the New York Times guy to Mexico City, and they never run a story. Can you imagine today if the head of the CIA, called up the head of and said, don't do this? I mean, Judge Webster who's here. I wonder what luck he'd have with that conversation. So the rules have changed.
But Ike is heartbroken because it really is the one thing he doesn't want, which is to destroy his credibility. Right. But is he heartbroken also because his chance for disarmament and détente have just gone? I mean, didn't he really want that?
Yes, he wanted, yes. He had been working and working and working to get to the point with Khrushchev that you could have an arms control treaty and the beginning of what later became known as détente. They were actually using that word, although not publicly. And this was the end of that, because once that summit blows up, it actually was the beginning of the darkest period of the Cold War. The dangerous period really begins in the summer, the real dangerous period, summer 1960 through the missile crisis in October 1962. Those are the true crisis years.
In Berlin again.
Berlin again. Because Kennedy, or that whippersnapper, as Eisenhower called him, wasn't really ready for the job when he took it over, and he allows Khrushchev to bully him at the Vienna summit in May, June 1961. Pigs goes badly. Cold War really takes a dangerous turn. Fortunately, President Kennedy learned on the job and handles himself admirably in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But as you can all recall, that was a very dangerous time.
The missile gap comes up right around then, too, which I think also distresses.
Right. This is another reason why presidential candidates should not be allowed to talk about foreign policy.
Right.
Kennedy ran partly on the missile gap, which was a complete phony. Eisenhower, because of the U-2, knew there was, and truly Kennedy knew that there was no missile gap. But he gleefully, because it was a good Democratic issue, we got to spend more on missiles that the Soviets. Joe also would write these columns.
Was it Maxwell Taylor too, or?
No, he was not so bad on that. The chief offenders were Senator Symington, who was
senator from Rockwell or whatever.
Well, he was a senator from Atlas, a company that was building a Convair, building Atlas missiles, And there was, you know, the military-industrial complex. So they were feeding all this phony Air Force intelligence, particularly to Joe Alsop, who was writing all these stories about the missile gap, and saying in his pieces that President Eisenhower was flaccid. You can imagine how Eisenhower liked that, throwing this newspaper across the room. But the press picked up this hue and cry and actually believed this missile gap nonsense, and it became rote. It was sort of embarrassing when Kennedy came in and McNamara had to admit to the press, well, actually, there's a missile gap, all right. It all runs U.S. to the Soviets. I think at that time we had...
The gap had what?
The gap. Well, we had maybe 200 ICBMs, and the Soviets in the winter of 1961 had 4.
And we also had started developing, I think against Eisenhower's instincts, all sorts of intermediate nuclear weapons, right?
Well, the one they liked was the Polaris.
Right,
submarine-based. That was, it gave you deterrence you couldn't defeat.
Right.
As long as you have those submarines and you can't find them, that's the beginning of mutual assured destruction. The Russians are never going to get you. So he was for that part. Eisenhower, I feel, I was just reading an article about this today. Eisenhower, not perfect. I've been tooting his horn, but not perfect. And one of the things he lost control of was the production of nuclear weapons. Right. 18,000 is too many.
But even after Strauss leaves.
Even after Strauss leaves. And he gets briefed on, in November 1960, after the election, Eisenhower, all these services are rivals, Navy, you know, competing with the Air Force for building nukes. And Eisenhower says, okay, let's have one plan. One plan. It was called the Single Integrated Operating Plan, the SIOP. Eisenhower gets the first ever briefing on the PSYOP in November of 1960, and he goes, oh my God, because it is going to make the rubble bounce all over Russia. I mean, we use about the word for it was overkill, enormous overkill. And Eisenhower realizes that Curtis LeMay out there at the Strategic Air Command and General Power, and that we got too much. And he sends a science advisor out there to look into it, but it's too late. I mean, when Kennedy gets the PSYOP briefing, he turns to Dean Rusk and he says, and they call us human beings. I mean, that talk about overkill. And that, of course, went on. For all I know, the PSYOP is still overkill, although I think they've whittled it down to about 500 weapons.
Did that lead to the military-industrial complex speech?
It informed it. It helped. It's hard to trace the exact, I've tried, and there's some paper trail on the creation of that speech, but it really begins with, this is how things happen. Ike's military aide, his naval aide, Peter And, would bring in magazines, high-tech from the industry, from the armaments industry, and they were starting to proliferate, all these magazines, because they were getting a lot of money, and they were getting well-funded, and they were looking for dollars. And Eisenhower kept looking at these magazines going, what is all this? Mm-hmm. And that's when he first used this word, the military-industrial complex, and his speechwriter took that and ran with it.
What's the relationship with Nixon at that point?
John Eisenhower told me that his father gave himself an order to like Richard Nixon. It is unfair because Nixon was actually a good vice president. Was disciplined and it was tough. If you may recall the Chequers speech, 1952, Nixon gets in trouble because of this slush fund that was actually innocuous and perfectly legal. And Ike does not stand by his vice president. He lets him twist in the wind. And Nixon famously goes on TV and gives the Chequers speech and saves his job. But no thanks to President Eisenhower, who very hands-off about the whole thing. This is the cold Ike. And right to the end, famously in August 1960, when Nixon is running for president and really needs Eisenhower's support, at a press conference, a reporter says to President Eisenhower, can you give us an example of something that Nixon has done, the vice president has done on foreign policies? And Ike says, well, if you give me a week, I'll think of something. Brutal.
Was that intentional?
No, what happened, it's like all these things. What happened was Ike was feeling that his own authority was being undermined, that people were questioning his own activism. And the truth was, by summer of 1960, Ike is sick, He's older. He is slowing down. Ike played golf 800 times as president, and that summer he was playing a lot of golf.
Let me ask you the Steve Smith, Evan Thomas question. The book begins with golf and ends with golf.
A lot of golf.
What is golf? I mean, what was the hold of golf on
Well,
him?
having
His secretary, he's like ordering
as a
him.
new and extremely bad golfer, I have an appreciation for this. Golf is not a good game for perfectionists. And Eisenhower was a perfectionist, and he used it as relaxation. It was the worst possible sport for him to relax by, because he was angry and tense the whole time. One time he threw his chipping wedge at his doctor, and almost broke his leg, because his doctor, trying to make him feel better when he had muffed a shot, said, "Nice shot." Ike said, "Nice shot, hell," and threw his club at him. So this was his form of relaxation, but not a good one.
And finally, before we open it up, what lessons, if you're looking at people looking at Iran or anything else for today?
Well, I mean, Eisenhower, to me, the lesson that sticks with me is the all or nothing one. Don't do military engagements unless you're damn sure you're going to win. Yeah. And presidents forget that. Presidents who believe in flexible responses, surgical strikes, and all that. Ike didn't believe in any of that. And
what would he have thought of drones?
He would liked the covert side. He would have applauded Obama's strategy of killing people silently, efficiently. He would have been all for that.
Please, comments, corrections, questions, please. Yes, sir. And could you identify? Yeah.
The relationship between President Kennedy and President Eisenhower definitely improved. Am I correct from that whippersnapper comment?
It did. Eisenhower's initial instinct was he was dubious about Joe Kennedy and all that. But he liked Kennedy when he first met him more than he thought he would. And he grew to respect him. There's a great scene. This is why experience matters. Eisenhower did create this force that later became the Bay of Pigs. But I don't think Eisenhower ever would have sent him in, certainly under that invasion plan, without air cover and changing the. And so after the Bay of Pigs failed, Kennedy invites Eisenhower to Camp David. Kennedy is distraught, and he wants to know what happened. And so Eisenhower starts quizzing him, and he says, "Did you talk to the generals about this? And you talked to the Joint Chiefs?" And Kennedy said, "Sort of." And so Eisenhower bores in, and he finds out that the Joint Chiefs said to Kennedy about the CIA invasion of Cuba, "Yeah, sure, that's fine." Meaning, it's not our operation. It's the CIA's operation. We wouldn't do it ourselves. But Kennedy, green and unpracticed, couldn't hear the dog whistle. The secret message from the generals. We're saying it's okay because it's the CIA's operation. We don't care if they fail. And Eisenhower, of course, had a great ear for that dog whistle and never would have, I'm sure, never would have permitted the invasion to go forth that way. And that was a kind of a bonding experience between the two of them as teacher and pupil, so to speak. They talked some, and they got along reasonably well after that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am. Hey, Linda.
And talk about the relationship with LBJ.
This was unfortunate. They talked past each other. Eisenhower was a patriot, and he believed you have to support your president. Now, the relevance here is that LBJ wanted Eisenhower's support on Vietnam. Eisenhower made it pretty clear, I think, to Johnson that if you're going to do Vietnam, go all the way. Go all the way. Don't do it by half measures. But LBJ didn't really hear that. All he really wanted was President Eisenhower publicly saying, "I support the president," and he got that. And Goodpaster, among others, felt that LBJ used Eisenhower in a way that Eisenhower let himself be used. By 1965-66, Eisenhower's heart troubles are really pretty serious, and he lets himself be used by President Johnson in ways that I think, in retrospect, were unfortunate.
Speaking of countries that he did not send troops into, among them was Vietnam after Dien Bien Phu. Yeah.
1954, there's a lot of pressure on him to send. The French are collapsing at Dien Bien Phu. There's a lot of pressure to send troops in. And Eisenhower in one of these meetings says that the jungle will consume the army by divisions. Of course, he was right.
Correct.
Correct.
Very correct. Yeah. Yes.
Could you speak to the relationship between Eisenhower and Truman, and Eisenhower's deciding to run for the president, and Truman wanting to get an answer from him whether he would do it or not?
Yep. I mean, this is an amazing thing. In 1946, President Truman goes to General Eisenhower and says, in 1948, if you run for president, on the top of the ticket, I'll run as your vice president. The sitting president of the United States made this offer to Eisenhower. Eisenhower turned him down. Years later, Truman denied this, but they found proof of it in Truman's own papers. This is how great Eisenhower's reputation was as the all-conquering general, and how relatively insecure in his job Truman was in 1946. He became more secure. Now, that relationship, which started out as worshipful, Truman worshiping Eisenhower, became fraught by 1952. And political campaigns tend to not endear people from opposite parties, and you know, that added to the strain. But Eisenhower's son, John, was in Korea as a major, seeing combat for the first time. And John was brought home to the inauguration. And Ike said to Truman, he said, who brought John, my son John, home here? And Truman said, I did. And there was this testy, you know, I'm still the president. I call the shots here about who's coming home. And so they didn't speak to each other in the car going up to Capitol Hill at Inauguration Day, 1953. And relations remained very strained. Andy Goodpaster was routinely tearing up angry letters that Ike would write to Truman, and Truman didn't bother to tear up his letters. I mean, he was spreading nasty rumors about Ike and Kay Summersby, and he and Dean Acheson and Truman loved to get together and talk about what a bad president Eisenhower was.
By the way, I'll give a shout out to Nancy Gibbs, and Michael Duffy has a book, The President's Club, which has many of these stories of the relationships amongst the presidents.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Patrick, and then,
Hi. Can you talk about his relationship with Harold Stassen, who became a Secretary of Peace for the first time?
Yeah, this was an unfortunate relationship. Stassen was the youngest boy governor, I think they called him, in Minnesota. He'd been Admiral Halsey's chief of staff in World War II, was an impressive young politician. And Eisenhower, to try to get arms control going, gives a special appointment to Stassen, and the press started calling him the Secretary for Peace. Very unfortunate, because the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, does not like to have the competition from this whippersnapper Stassen. So immediately there are bureaucratic rivals. Nelson Rockefeller, another shrinking violet, is also working on this. And so bureaucratic war breaks out. And Stassen was maladroit about it.
Yeah, he kind of screws up.
He screws up. He goes to the Russians and tells them what the American deal is before it's actually been formally offered, makes the Allies mad.
Before the British and the French even knew.
Before the British and the French even knew. I mean, Stassen is he's a bad Secretary for Peace, and it sets back the cause of arms control.
And he ends up being ousted, right?
Ends up being ousted, yeah.
Has to go run for...
Well, he's told to report directly to Dulles, which is the same.
I know,
so
this is getting back to, are you actually fired? You know, one way to do it is say, now
you're reporting to Dulles. So he quit to run for governor, I guess.
Good to see you again, Bob. Here. Is that you back there?
I am.
Yes, yes.
It's nice to be seen.
That's right.
Evan, talk about Ike and McCarthy. Why did he defend Marshall? Why was he weak on that?
I'm sorry, why did he defend Marshall?
Joe, why didn't he defend General
why
Marshall?
Didn't he defend?
Didn't he? This is in the view of even some of Eisenhower's own supporters, an inglorious chapter in the general's history here. The anecdote, the story that really upset people was that when Eisenhower was running for president in 1952, his speechwriters put in an Eisenhower speech a paragraph denouncing McCarthy, because McCarthy had called General Marshall, the sainted General Marshall, and close friend of mentor to Eisenhower, calling him a coward or whatever the hell McCarthy
That he
called
was protecting.
That he was
yeah.
protecting commies. And Eisenhower, campaigning in Wisconsin, removed that sentence from the speech. He didn't want to be seen attacking McCarthy in his own state. Wisconsin was a swing state. This was seen as a cowardly move. In those days, presidential candidates had close contact with publishers, and Arthur Sulzberger, not Punch, but his father, was involved in writing this speech and knew that the paragraph had been pulled, and it got out to the press that the paragraph had been pulled. And there was great disappointment that Eisenhower had not stood up for his friend Marshall. Now, having said that, and then continued to be great disappointment that when Eisenhower got in office, that he was soft on McCarthy. Eisenhower would say to his aides, I'm not going to get into the gutter with that guy, I'm not going to get into a pissing match with a skunk. His approach was to let McCarthy hang himself. And that did happen. It took a year. The Army McCarthy hearings were about 14 months after Eisenhower became president. McCarthy had been running wild since 1950.
By the way, that's your first book, wasn't it?
I did. I ghost wrote a book by the Army lawyer, God, what was his name?
Shoot.
I've forgotten it. No, not Joe Welch. It was his, what was his name? I ghost wrote his book. I got paid $4,000. It worked out to about 10 cents a word.
Yeah.
It was Without Precedent was the title, and I know I'll think of his name. Adams.
Yeah, thank
Good for you, Walter.
No more calls? We have a winner. Yeah.
Adams, he was a sweet guy, and then he needed a ghostwriter, so yeah, I wrote about it.
Anyway, sorry,
It was a long time ago.
Yes, and but I still don't get why Eisenhower was, I don't know, the word squirrely when it came to McCarthy?
Well, I think his view was he didn't want to pick a big fight with his right flank. I mean, you think the Republican has parties with its right wing now. I guess the Republican Party is its right wing now. But in those days, there was a big division between the moderate Republicans, a species that extinct with the possible exception of people in this room. And, you know, but in those days, the moderate Republicans were a force. Eisenhower was one of them, and then there was a conservative
picking
wing.
Nixon, who was a bit of a red baiter.
Absolutely, was to help keep the right wing at bay, to communicate with the right wingers. Style Bridges, Jenner, Noland. These were staunch, known as the Old Guard, and they were staunch conservatives. They wanted to dismantle the New Deal. One of the things that Eisenhower doesn't really get credit for, but it's significant, is that had a more conservative president come in, there was a lot of feeling then that we ought to just dismantle the New Deal.
Yeah, I mean, people do talk now about how polarized and how, you know, the Republican right versus is, you know, so it actually pales a bit in comparison to 51, 52, 53 and McCarthyism.
It was pretty nasty.
Truman and the Red Dean. I mean,
Red Dean,
nobody's calling,
McCarthy, as all of you know, was out of control, and he was calling Dean Acheson of all people, saying he was soft on communism. Dean Acheson's cowardly college, the Red Dean is cowardly college of communist appeasers or whatever the hell it was. I mean, and so the politics, we always put a rosy glow on the past. One of the great reasons to write history is because it reminds you that things weren't all that great in the past either.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Yeah.
John Adams putting Ben Franklin's grandson in jail. I mean, you know, it was tough earlier on. Corby Kummer, we're going to have a food question, I hope.
Sorry, not a food question.
Why was his stomach so bad? Yes.
If Eisenhower counseled LBJ to go all or nothing in Vietnam and was a mentor and teacher to Kennedy, did they not discuss Vietnam?
They did, but they talked past each other. Eisenhower would say, you know, bomb Hanoi, go all the way, declare war. And LBJ would nod, but that's really not what he wanted to do. He wanted to do a gradual escalating, exactly what Eisenhower didn't like, a gradualist escalation, allow sanctuaries. In fact, John Eisenhower told me a story of McNamara and Cy Vance, 1 and 2 at Defense, coming to see President Eisenhower in the hospital to check in with him about Vietnam. And Eisenhower said, declare war, you know, go all the way. And as John said, McNamara and Vance couldn't get out of there fast enough because that's not what they wanted to hear. So they beat a quick retreat.
Eisenhower really believed that?
Well, you know, it's hard to know. It's hard to know. But Eisenhower, although Walter and I wrote a book called The Wise Men, in my old age, I've come to be a little suspicious about wise men because wise men don't have the information often, but their views are hardening. You know, Atchison was a good wise man eventually on Vietnam, but he was not a good wise man in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Or Berlin. He wanted to bomb in Cuba. He was, in fact, if arguably President Kennedy had taken Dean Acheson's advice in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we'd all be radioactive dust. I mean, and so wise men can be useful, but they can also know too little and think too much. And I don't think that Ike was a great wise man to presidents. He was older. He hated student protesters. All of that was kind of hardening his view. He wanted them all to get a haircut. You know, he was not a great advisor.
Great, great. No, I was going to say last question, but we'll do lightning rounds of questions here.
Evan, I wonder if you got a sense for Eisenhower's relationship with General MacArthur, which I understand was strange over the years, but wonder in particular whether you had a sense for his reaction when Truman fires MacArthur.
Eisenhower, a little known, forgotten fact, Eisenhower was MacArthur's chief of staff for 9 years in the 1930s, and he taught Eisenhower what not to do. Because Eisenhower's whole MO was to be modest and to have that kind of confidence that is humble confidence. One thing I loved about Eisenhower, we were talking about lessons for the future that I wish people would, Eisenhower had a kind of confidence that allowed him to be humble. He wasn't, you know, he was not arrogant. I know when I become arrogant, it's because I feel weak and fearful. And I think that's true of most people. When they're blustering, it's because they're afraid of something. Ike had this model of leadership of quiet confidence. And MacArthur was a blowhard. He was a great general in some ways, although modern scholars are pretty tough on MacArthur now. His star, even in military history, is really falling. And he was vainglorious and did not have great judgment a lot of the time. So Ike studied that, although there's a funny story where Ike and MacArthur are on a panel in about 1951 or 1952, and Eisenhower's talking about the importance of civilian leadership and how he's just a military guy and he really doesn't want the presidency. And MacArthur pats him on the knee and says, Ike, you just keep talking that way. You'll get it soon enough.
Is that right there? Yeah. Yeah.
Evan, I'm sorry I haven't read your book, so I don't know if you covered this at all. But it seems to me that Eisenhower was a conflicted man in his own personal beliefs. If I'm correct, he is the one who instigated the interstate system in this country as a means of providing us with the infrastructure. As a military man, he knew how important that was.
Yeah, he'd seen the Autobahn in Germany.
Mm-hmm. And, well, I'm sure he had also seen what had happened in the Soviet Union and places in Eastern Europe where they hadn't had any roads and things.
The railway track went to Gettysburg, which is why Lee lost.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, that was defense money. Excuse me, the defense money that actually paid for the highways. That was a Defense Act.
Right.
But was he behind that? I mean, it's been my understanding that it was basically his idea.
Yes, it was. He was the moving party.
Technically thinking that we needed that kind of infrastructure because there might be a war. Mm-hmm. So he was a man of war who understood that as a problem. And the second part of my question is, when the tanks rolled into Hungary in 1956, did he have second thoughts about dealing with the Soviet Union? Stalin had died. There was a new regime, and many people had hoped that it wouldn't be as vicious as it was. But when that happened, did you get any feeling as to his reaction to that? As again, I apologize, I haven't read your book.
Yeah,
so I don't
sure.
know.
Well, a couple of things on Hungary. He knew that the United States couldn't do anything about it because they're landlocked and it was going to be crazy. So right away, he was not going to intervene militarily. But the CIA was telling him, oh, great, the Hungarian Revolution is terrific, and that Moscow is going to let this happen. Wrong call, because, as you know, the tanks did roll. Eisenhower did not subscribe to the view that the Soviets were going to be benign about all this. He was not surprised when the tanks rolled. He was not flustered by it. He was a very cool cat because, as you may recall, Hungary was happening at the exact same time as the Suez Crisis. And it was a great moment of watching a president deal with multiple crises on the eve of an election and being so calm about it that while it was going on, he had spent a day watching football and playing bridge with his buddies. Yeah. Just, you know, now LBJ would have had 5 TV sets on, and there would have, you know, else would have been down in the war room, and you know, Eisenhower knew when to cool it, but he was quietly pulling the plug on Great Britain. He wanted Britain to cease and desist this invasion, and he made sure quietly that Britain would not get any more oil if their oil was cut off. He said, let them boil in their own oil. And he quietly started a run on the pound. So typical Ike working behind the scenes to get what he wanted.
Very cunning. 2 quick final questions there and there, if we would. Yeah.
I take your point about Eisenhower, the guy who threatens the ultimate in order to not have to intervene. But, you know, you can't really go through Eisenhower's records without seeing that there really is a contradiction. This same person who's doing that, on the one hand, is simultaneously, and you said so yourself, you know, enthusiastically intervening with the CIA in various places, sending U.S. military aid to various places that create, wait, let me finish, that create sort of crisis situations. So on the one hand, he's trying to resist intervening, and on the other hand, he's creating propensities to do this. I wonder, how do you square that circle?
The two are related. One reason why he used the CIA so much was he didn't want to use the Army. He thought that the CIA could do it quietly on the cheap, and he knew that if you have to send the military in, bad things happen. But he was hopeful that he could use quiet, covert means to contain communism in the Middle East, in South America, places that they believed that it was on the march. Now, these were not crises at the time. Guatemala was declared a victim. You know, years later, we think that was a bad idea because they propped up these right-wing regimes. But at the time, it looked like we were stopping a leftist regime. Same thing in Iran. Now, the CIA started having unsuccessful coups by about the mid-50s, and in Indonesia, Syria, things started going wrong. Eisenhower then, I think, should have made a change in leadership at the CIA. He didn't, and I think he can be faulted for that. He did not control the CIA as well as he should have. He didn't want to have congressional oversight because he thought that was a prescription for disaster. He used his friends, really, to oversee it, but his friends weren't enough.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Nancy. Nancy? Yeah.
I'm in awe of both of you for the kind of books you're able to write, and I just wanted to ask a process question, Evan. How you come to decide, how you decided to write this book, whether you write the themes, you have them going in, or how it develops, your special sources. You've obviously gone beyond just reading the books that have been written.
Sure.
And how long it takes to do this kind of a wonderful book.
It takes 3 or 4 years. I mean, I really started with John Newhouse, having lunch with John Newhouse, and this idea of being interested in the loneliness of command, a president coping with this unbelievable burden of having nuclear weapons, and do you use them or not? That's where I began. I read John's book about nuclear policy. I read Mac Bundy's book about nuclear policy. There's good academic literature on this. There's a guy named Campbell Craig who wrote a terrific book called Destroying the Village, which I read. You know, if you go looking for it, you can find some really smart thinking. you know, I went to Abilene. I spent a lot of time in the archives there. I was blessed to have this doctor's diary, because his doctor kept a daily diary that measured Ike's mood, because they were worried about him blowing a gasket. Including the golf. So that was manna from heaven for a historian to have the guy's family doctor writing down his daily mood. Also, his secretary, Ann Whitman, wrote about his mood often. There are other diarists who are in his government. You know, as all historians do, you look for the paper trail. And as I said, I was blessed to have John Eisenhower, who was just this wonderful guide, back into that. Not too many living people. Susan Eisenhower helped me a lot. I'm really grateful to her. You know, it's a little bit here and a little bit there, but Eisenhower, as I said, generally kept good records.
John Eisenhower loves this book, as I've heard him say, but with Whitman, the secretary, and the doctor stuff, what Evan has really been able to do is connect the personal, the real person, which is difficult, as John Eisenhower said, to know the real person, with the policy. This is a profoundly important book, but it's also a delightful, readable book, and it's for sale out there from our friends at Politics and Prose. And Evan will sign it.
Thank you, Walter.
Thanks. Great. Thanks. Cool.